Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar as a part of the Humanities in Class webinar series with the National Humanities Center. Tonight, we're going to be focused on the topic Government and Aviation in the 20th Century, from the Wright Brothers to the Boeing 707 Jetliner. We'll be joined by our old friend now in this series, Bernie Carlson from the University of Virginia. My name is Andy Menk. I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center, and I'm joining you tonight from my home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I get a sense that that all of you have either come directly from your classroom if you're out on the West Coast. I know we often have many teachers from Los Angeles and other parts of the state, or you've had a chance to kind of get home and get settled in if you're closer to our time zone. Either way, we very much appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules, out of the sort of claustrophobia that spring brings to come and join us in this conversation. As many of you know who have joined us on these webinars before, this will be an audio and PowerPoint-based webinar. As we move through this, though, probably the most important component is the chat box that's located in the bottom portion of your GoToTraining control panel. That's where you can answer questions, you can register thoughts, you can share resources. And my job as moderator is to mine and curate those questions and find the appropriate time to share them with Bernie. And as we go through that, it may be that you ask something that's really interesting and compelling in the moment, and it sort of scrolls and gets lost in the chatter feed. If that's the case, please don't hesitate to ask it again, or to find some way to bring that back to our attention. We very much want to encourage that sort of interaction as we go through tonight's content. At the end of tonight's session, you will be asked to complete a survey, and once that's completed, you'll be able to download your certificate of participation. This will certify the hours that you've spent, not just with the webinar itself tonight, but also the pre-reading materials. And this is a certificate that you can share with your administration and insert into your teaching portfolio. National Humanities Center is now in our 40th year, and we're very pleased to be able to work with scholars, elite scholars like Professor Carlson, as a way to advance the understanding of the humanities, as a way to offer the humanities and all disciplines in the humanities as a blueprint for how to better understand the world that we live in. A big part of this kind of work, this bridge that we build between scholarship and teaching, is working with the right partners. And I'm very pleased to partner again for tonight's webinar with the National Council for History Education. I'm currently a board member of NCHE. We just completed our annual conference in San Antonio, Texas this past weekend, and I feel very strongly in the mission and the ability for NCHE to reach teachers where they need to be met, to really find a way to blend the scholarship, the pedagogy, and the technology in a model that is very applicable and very relevant for the classroom. Tonight, we're actually joined by Justin Jakovich, who's, I just unmuted you, Justin. I'm gonna invite you to come in and say hello and maybe describe in your own words a little bit about NCHE and what we're offering.
Great, thanks, Andy. Just to give you a little brief background on the National Council for History Education, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a 501c3 nonprofit that was formed as a successor to the Bradley Commission for History in Schools back in 1990. They developed something called the History's Habits of Mind, and ever since then we've been using those habits of mind to provide professional development. We pioneered a colloquium model in the 1990s and used that model extensively throughout the early 2000s. We worked with hundreds of districts through the Teaching American History grants, and post Teaching American History grant world, we've refined our mission to more history, better taught, and in that we emphasize both greater class time for history instruction and a focus on providing teachers the skills that they need throughout their career. We're grateful now to be a part of the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium, which sponsors these sessions. We're working with them on a series of both colloquia and webinars titled Technology's Impact in American History. So we're working with the Army Heritage Education Center, for instance. Still openings left for this summer's program in June in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This particular program that we're talking about this evening is based off of material that came out of our out of our partnership with the Astronaut Memorial Foundation and a program that we did earlier this year at the Kennedy Space Center. Our third partner is the U.S. Patent and Trademarks Office in Alexandria, Virginia. This evening, after this evening's session, each participant will receive a follow-up email from NCHE with the ability to redeem a membership for the coming year. We encourage you to respond to that message with some greater detail about yourself, including your address, and that will allow you to activate your membership. And lastly, we did just finish up our last conference in San Antonio, Texas. That finished up on Saturday. Our next national conference will take place from March 14 through 16, 2019, over in Arlington, Virginia, at the Crystal Gateway Marriott. So, Andy, thank you so much for the time to introduce ourselves a little bit, and thank you so much to Andy and Bernie for continuing to work with us on these interesting programs.
Thanks, Justin. And I want to underscore the benefit that each of you will receive by activating your NCHE membership. It not only will give you access to instructional materials and professional development opportunities, but it'll join you in a community of history educators that continually work to advance the ways in which we think about history and the history classroom. Thanks again, Justin. Similarly, the National Humanities Center works hard to develop materials and to provide opportunities for teachers to work directly with scholars, to be in conversation with scholars, to better understand content, to become better teachers. In some cases, this results in free online materials like our American Class digital repository. You can go to the address there and find a deep pool of lessons and instructional materials that are classroom ready and scholar vetted. It also includes these webinars, which I find on an annual basis to be some of the most provocative ways to ask scholars and educators to work directly together. We are actually finishing this year's webinar series this week. Tomorrow will be our last session. I'm very pleased to share with you that we've reached nearly 5,000 educators over the last 25 sessions. We started in mid-September or so and very quickly began to fill and to sell out our sessions. Sellout's a figure of phrase because these are all free and these are available to teachers, but we do reach capacity. And so for the coming year, we're going to encourage you to mark your calendar for when we open our registration on August the 13th, 2008, right as you're preparing to get back into your classroom and thinking about ways to attack your curriculum. At 10 a.m. Eastern, we'll open the registration for next year's webinar series. There'll be many compelling topics that I think you'll find relevant both for the curriculum you teach and for the extracurricular conversations you have with students. Some of the confirmed topics include the myths of Game of Thrones, the Second Amendment, taxes and race, 1968, of course, is the 50th year anniversary, addiction in America, modern slavery, and the history of hip hop. So please keep that URL bookmarked and put it on your calendar. August 13th, we will release registration for next year's session. At the same time, we're also working to take that content and make visible the process of working in humanities disciplines. We've recently published an iBook to iTunes that will allow you to download for free a very interactive multimedia compilation that articulates the value of 10 different humanities disciplines. In each of these chapters, we've had a scholar and a teacher work closely together to create video and audio and text-based materials that make visible the process that they use in that discipline. We've asked the scholars to really articulate how they think about attacking research and how they think about developing arguments in their field. And we've asked teachers to articulate how they then translate that for a younger audience. I think you'll find this iBook is not just interactive in the way that the content is put together, but it's also interactive in its delivery. And I'm very pleased to be able to recognize not just the disciplinary practice of these 10 fields, but also the ways that they intersect, the ways that they have commonalities and they have synonyms that allow us to really think about interdisciplinary connections. Please go onto iTunes, download this to any Apple product, whether it's your MacBook Pro, your iPad, or your iPhone. If you don't have an Apple product, then we do have this available in PDF format as well. It's not quite as interactive, but you can still get a good sense of the content and think about ways to share that with your classes and with your students. Finally, I'd like to also announce that we are currently accepting applications to the 2018-19 Teachers Advisory Council. This past year, we worked with 14 wonderful educators from all over the country, and their contributions really helped make relevant and helped keep applicable the work that we do at the Humanities Center. We're accepting applications for next year's cohort until May the 11th. So just a couple more weeks to get your materials in. You can go to our website and use the scroll down menu under education programs to find the application process, or you can follow the link that I've got on the screen there. So all that's a way to frame tonight's session. You know, I for better or for worse, spending a whole lot of time on planes, and you know, it strikes me every single time that I taxi onto a tarmac and I find myself in the air, and then I find myself touching down just a few hours later in another faraway place. I'm really struck by just how significant aviation has changed the human condition, how it's shrunk geography, how it's given us access to people and places and ideas that never would have happened before. And I think being able to see that in context of 20th century America is going to be a really unique way to think about the merging of technology and culture. With us tonight is Bernie Carlson, and he's led several webinars for us in this partnership with NCHE. He's a fascinating speaker in terms of unlocking this role of technology. Bernie, hello, greetings. How are things in Virginia?
They're very good, thank you. And we've had a lot of rain, but the clouds have parted this afternoon, and it's a lovely, cool evening here. I'm sitting in my office looking out at the flowering trees. It's dogwood season in Charlottesville, and for most of us that's fine. For a few of us, fortunately not me, it's also major hay fever season.
Bernie, let me ask you something before you get started. Bernie, when's the last time you flew?
The last time I flew was on Thursday of last week. I flew back from Dublin, Ireland, on a plane. So I was thinking about your thoughts as well. That we take flying for granted, and it is so much of our everyday life. And tonight I want to kind of unpack that.
And I think that's why I asked it in the sort of playful way that I did. And I didn't necessarily expect you to say Ireland, but you know, it strikes me how we can answer that question without even thinking about it. Really, it's such an assumption now that we can go from point A to point B across the globe, and I'm really anxious to hear how you do that unpacking.
Good. Well, anyhow, I want to welcome my numbers here on the line show that we've got 58 guests with us, Andy. And let me tell all of our guests a little bit about who I am and what one of my favorite children's stories when my daughters, they're now in their 20s, when I was reading to them was little, had a story that had a punchline. You know, the recurring line was, "Who are you and what do you eat?" I am indeed a history. I am indeed a professor at the University of Virginia. I am indeed a historian. I'm a historian of technology, and that means at UVA, I hang my hat in the engineering school, where I teach primarily engineering students, and I engage them in thinking about how they are entering a profession and both a discipline. And it's been a great experience for the last 30 years. The slide that you got in front of me, and Andy is driving the slide, so periodically I may sort of say to Andy, I need the next one, please. You can see a couple of the books that I've written. In addition to those two books, some of you may be interested that a few years back, I did a project called Technology and World History, which covers 18 civilizations from the Stone Age to the Space Age. And that was designed for the high school and public library markets. And it is 7 small volumes. And when I was doing the project, I said to my editor, "Why are we doing 7 volumes?" And she lowered her eyeglasses and looked at me like I was an idiot. And she said, "Because students will then be able to each take a different volume home and do their projects." And that in many ways signaled to me that there was so much to learn about how to effectively deliver material to all of our different audiences out there, but especially that there are ways that we need to think creatively about how to engage students in the K-12 space. And so that's really driven my desire to be part of Andy's organization, and indeed this project that Justin described a moment ago with the National Council for History Education. And we're doing a series of workshops each year for teachers. We've done 2 so far this year, one at the Kennedy Space Center with the Astronaut Memorial Foundation, and another one with the U.S. Patent Office in Alexandria, Virginia. And as Justin said, we've got another really cool one coming up with the Army Heritage Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This is the equivalent of the U.S. Army Museum. Apparently, if they called it a museum, they wouldn't be able to be funded, so it has to be a heritage and education center. And it is a really interesting place because you see how the Army uses history to teach officers, sergeants, non-commissioned officers, and even just ordinary soldiers, ordinary privates. But tonight I want to start my story with the mythic story of Icarus and from Greek mythology. And then you go on ahead and show them the next slide. Many of you know the legend that Icarus succeeded in flying, but he did so with wings that were made by his father, Daedalus, and Daedalus used wax. Yes.
Bernie, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do want to say that I've given you the mouse control. So use that. Use the keys on your keyboard the arrows on your keyboard. I bet you can advance it yourself.
Okay,
if it does, then I'll be happy to help you.
Yeah, no, ladies and gentlemen, pay no attention. Maybe I did it. Maybe you did it.
I'll do it for you, but no problem. Thank you.
Right, you need to do it. Okay, sorry about that. So,
no problem.
Yeah. Anyhow, and so we know the story of Icarus, that he basically flew because his father made him wings. The wings were made of a combination of feather and wax, but Icarus became so enthralled with flying that he flew too close to the sun, ignoring his father's instructions. And of course, the heat of the sun melted the wax, and the poor lad crashed into the sea and drowned. One of my favorite images of this myth from the ancient world is this painting from the 1550s or 1560s by the Flemish old master Pieter Bruegel, and it is called, of course, Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. This painting is actually a copy of Bruegel's original painting, but we don't need to do the art history part of this. As you look at this painting, you'll see that the scene is dominated by, sort of dead center with the red sweatshirt on, a medieval plowman who is concentrating on his work, followed, and if you look a little closely kind of to his immediate right, you'll see that there's a shepherd tending his sheep, and indeed the other sort of human activity that's going on in this painting is the caravel, the ship out in the harbor whose sails are luffing and it's getting ready to sail off. And you might ask quite reasonably, where, if this painting is called The Fall of Icarus, is Icarus? And if you look closely, just behind the ship, almost in the lower right-hand corner, there's Icarus's legs plunged into the sea, and there he is drowning. And the message of this painting, I think, is an interesting one. I think that the Flemish master that created it wanted to remind us that often the most impressive moments in creativity go unnoticed and underappreciated. Icarus sailed in the sun, did something pretty amazing, but then crashed into the sea, and the ordinary people in everyday life paid no attention to it. Neither the plowman nor the shepherd nor the sailors on the ship took any notice. And to this interpretation, I want to add an idea that inventions, here we're going to be talking tonight about aviation, often take off, I apologize for the pun, only when the circumstances are right. In the world that is depicted in this painting, there was no place for flying humans. There was no reason for people to be looking up in the sky, wondering what Icarus was up to. Indeed, and I'm going to argue tonight, that aviation as we know it, the airlines that we travel on, the jetliners, the airports that we pass through, the whole package of aviation only developed in the 20th century, not only because the Wright people, and I'm going to argue that indeed the Wright people were the Wright brothers tonight, took up aviation and pursued it, but also because the circumstances were right, particularly the political and military circumstances made it possible to develop aviation only in the 20th century. So let me go on to the next slide. So we're going to talk tonight about the idea of cultural change. And I often draw this little graph for my students on the blackboard. Of course, I'm talking about engineers, so they're used to images like this. But if you look at that lower left-hand line, that's kind of where, you know, a technology might be at a certain given time. And then at some later time, might be a year, might be 10 years, might be 100 years later, the technology could be more developed, and you've got the higher line that's on the right. The interesting question for historians, I think, and indeed for our students is to ask the question that I say there in red: what happens in that middle space? What happens in time? What is necessary what are the necessary factors for a society to begin using a technology and accepting it? And again, aviation, the right circumstances, the society that was able to go from the lower to the higher level was the American society in the 20th century. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about, and then I'm ready for the next slide, if you don't mind, Andy, tonight I want to talk about a little bit about the history of aviation. I want to make sure that that we all know, so that we can think about it next time we fly, why airplanes stay up in the air. Want to recount the story of the Wright brothers and what they accomplished. And then the heart of the matter is really the next section, where I'll talk about the military and political context that shaped aviation in the decades between the 1910s, sort of right before World War I, up into the Cold War in the 1950s. And I'll say something about commercial aviation and also a bit about jet engines. So for those of you that are you know, in the history and social sciences, you will get bragging rights tonight to go in and basically tell people that you know how airplanes and jet engines fly. And if I don't explain these things clearly to you, I will keep an eye on the chat box, and you can ask me if I need to clarify anything. So let's get started. Again, one of the things that is important to get across to our students is how quickly aviation changed. And these two pictures are, I think, a great way of summarizing it. In just a little over 50 years, so 54 years, you go from the Wright Flyer on the left all the way to the Boeing 707, which was the first highly successful commercial airliner that was used in the United States and indeed around the world. And there are plenty of 707s that are still flying and taking passengers all over the world now, primarily in the developing world. But the 707 was the workhorse of the airline industry easily from the 1950s into the 1980s. So let me go to the next slide. So when we're telling the story of aviation, let's be clear that there really are two kinds of aircraft out there that we could be talking about. The first are lighter than aircraft, which are balloons, dirigibles, or blimps. And those were, you know, initially developed by the Montgolfier brothers, who flew the first lighter than aircraft, a paper balloon similar to this beautiful hand-colored image that you see on the screen. They flew that first hot air balloon in 1783. And you know, if your students have seen The Wizard of Oz, The Wizard of Oz is indeed exactly the same sort of balloon like this. And you know, not surprisingly, it's not easy to control. It goes where the wind carries it, much like at the very end of the Wizard of Oz. But we're not going to really talk about the Montgolfier brothers. It is a fascinating story about how they developed and came to the decision to build balloons like this in the late 18th century. We're going to instead focus on the other type of craft, which is heavier than aircraft, which includes airplanes and helicopters. I'm not going to say anything about helicopters, but they're heavier than another example of heavier than aircraft. So to understand where heavier than aircraft came from, we need to first ask the question: is why do birds fly? And you know, is it that they flap their wings, or is it the shape of their wings that allows them to soar in the sky? For centuries, people thought it was the flapping of wings that was important, and the way to fly, they thought, was to imitate the way that a way that the bird flapped its wing. And a great example of this is on the next slide, comes from Leonardo's notebooks, which are filled with a variety of images of flying machines. And one of them includes this sort of bat-like wing thing, where indeed the pilot or operator would have been in that little loop that you see in the middle of the plane, and he would have had his foot in the stirrups in the back, and he would have grabbed those upside down T's underneath each wing, and he would have had to flap those little puppies like crazy, those wings, in order to fly. Walter Isaacson's new biography of Leonardo is a great book. I've been enjoying it immensely, and I've been reading it as I go back and riding around in my car. And some of Leonardo's inventions, flying inventions, were probably never actually designed to fly by themselves, but were actually, and this is a really interesting example of the humanities and technologies interacting, Leonardo loved to put together the props and the arrangements and the costumes for plays and spectacles in Renaissance Florence and Italy. And so some of his airplane designs, his flying machine designs, were probably part of the props for some of these plays. Others, it's very clear that he had studied the design of birds, and he really was hoping to come up with a plane that could, or a device that could fly. Now, by the 19th century, however, people began to think about what actually happens with the development of flight. And did we skip a slide here, Andy? Just out of curiosity, we jump ahead here one, or no, we didn't. Okay, let me go see the next one. I'm wondering if we've got one out of place here. Yes, we do. Okay, and we'll go back to the other one, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for getting these slightly out of order. By the 19th century, an eccentric English aristocrat by the name of Sir George Cayley came to realize that the way forward for flight was to worry less about flapping wings and understanding more the shape of wings, since those wings could create this idea that what we called lift. Cayley was, I use the word deliberately, eccentric, because he was a prolific inventor, and he developed a whole range of things, including a lifeboat, tension spoke wheels like we have on a modern bicycle, a Caterpillar tractor, automatic signals for a railway crossing, and even an internal combustion engine that was powered by gunpowder. But he's best remembered for his aerial experiments. And after experimenting with flapping wings, Cayley came to the conclusion that what we should do is that we should pay attention to the shape of the wing, because the shape of the wing was what determined lift and allowed the wing to carry through the air. Cayley is the one that discovered that when a fluid like air flows over or under a body, it exerts a surface on the body. And that's now when we need to go backwards for a moment to the other slide. Okay, so anyhow, if you think that either air is rushing from the left to the right around that black sort of Nike-shaped image, which is the side view of an airfoil, okay, some of the air is going to follow the blue line and go over the top of the plane, and some of the air is going to go follow the red line and go underneath the air. Okay, if, however, you get enough air, sort of underneath, and you create a high pressure underneath the wing shape, you're going to have a force that is going to carry or lift that wing upwards, as shown by the black vertical arrow. And what's interesting is that while we engineers fully understand how to design wing shapes and how to take advantage of lift, they still actively debate certain aspects of this phenomena and whether it's really about, as this image shows, high versus low pressure or high velocity versus low velocity. But imagine the simple way I always think about this is the wing effectively traps some of the air, more of the air underneath the wing, creates pressure, and that pressure pushes or lifts the wing up. So again, Cayley was the first one to think about this. He designed a series of tables that showed you how to calculate, you know, an appropriate wing size that were wing shape that would get you enough lift to do certain jobs. And to test this all out, he built a glider, and he basically flew it across a valley in Yorkshire. And the little image on the slide, the next slide that we were looking at a moment ago from Cayley, that figure 1 is his early flying machine in 1853. And Cayley, again, was perhaps your classic snooty Irish Englishman, because instead of climbing in and riding in the basket himself there, he decided that his coachman ought to take the first flight across a valley in the Yorkshire Dales. Now, for decades, you know, by the closing decades of the 19th century, several more inventors followed up on what Cayley had done. In Germany, it included a man named Otto Lilienthal, and in the U.S., it was a railroad engineer named Dr. Chanute. And each of these individuals, you know, worked on and expanded the lift tables that were started by Cayley, so that both Lilienthal and Chanute could create their own winged gliders. And Chanute published his tables, which showed how different shaped wings could provide different amounts of lift. Of these other early experimenters, probably the one that made the most progress was an interesting man named Samuel Pierpont Langley. And I think we get to meet him on the next slide. Langley was an astronomer, an accomplished scientist, and a secretary of the Smithsonian. That means that he was the director of the Smithsonian. And Langley decided that his research project was going to be unmanned spaceflight. Langley made the decision that he should concentrate on power. You know, is it Scotty on Star Trek, Andy, that says, "Power, I need more power"?
Yeah, it is.
So Langley was of that mindset. And so indeed he experimented first with a steam-powered, not unmanned plane, which he flew, as you can see from this picture, off a houseboat that was anchored on the Potomac River near Washington, D.C. And with $50,000 from the Army and $20,000, he moved from basically what we would think of as an unmanned drone to a manned plane. And he decided that he would attempt this with a first flight on the 8th of December, 1903. And unfortunately, the plane took off from that catapult on the top of that houseboat and promptly crashed into the Potomac. And it was very disheartening, and Langley gave up his experiments. But just as Langley, you know, lost the heart to keep pursuing, the Wright brothers were gearing up to their ultimately successful flight. So who were Oliver and Wilbur Wright? The Wright brothers, and we can meet them on the next slide, were bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio. And they became fascinated as children with flight. And indeed, let's jump to the next slide, please. One of the toys that they got from their father, who was a bishop in the Methodist Church, or bishop in a Protestant church, I should say. I'd need to go back and make sure it actually was Methodist. Was no, we'll stay right there. He gave Wilbur and Orville this wooden toy, which many of us have seen, which is a stick with basically a propeller on top. And if you rub it between your hands, like the image shows, and at the right moment you let it go, it soars up into the to the sky. And indeed, this got them to thinking about flight and indeed about the possibilities of propellers. Now we'll go back to the next slide here, go backwards. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. All right. So when the Wright brothers began to investigate flight, they made a couple of key insights. They decided that the story or where they wanted to go was going to be to focus not on power, but on control of the plane. Okay, so they decided that internal combustion engines, unlike the steam engine that Langley had used, were going to be just fine. Internal combustion engines are kinds of engines that were being introduced for automobiles, the same kind of engine that we use today in a gasoline gasoline powered lawnmower. And they decided that, unlike Langley, who thought he needed at least a 50 horsepower engine in his aircraft, the Wright brothers were happy with an engine that produced just 12 horsepower. Of course, obviously, the less power you need, the lighter the engine you can get away with. And they also thought, and this is really the important piece, that the airplane would be more like a bicycle than a ship, and that it would require forward motion and continuous control for stability. Okay. So one of the great images that I got from teaching together with master teachers in Florida was we're going to skip not this slide, but the slide after that. And I apologize. And one more was is this wonderful image from the Library of Congress, and my fellow teacher in when we do the space history one shows this image, and this is airplanes or air taxis basically from a French publication in 1900, where people are leaving the French opera, and instead of course having horse-drawn carriages or horseless carriages, everybody is zipping around on new kinds of aircraft. And initially, I thought, wow, this is a really bizarre picture. And I said, why are all of these aircraft that are zipping around, why do they look like fish? And indeed, the wings don't look like wings that we often see, but they actually look like the fins on a fish. And the answer is that until the Wright brothers came along, most people, both, kind of artists like this, but even engineers, assumed that, that a heavier than aircraft was going to be inherently stable like a ship. Okay, so that you might as well draw it so that it looked like a fish. So this is an image that is underlines the wrong assumption that people had circa 1900 before the Wright brothers. They thought, oh, airplanes like ships would be inherently stable, so they kind of, the air would be like the water in the sea, and the fish would be stable, in the water, and so these aircraft would be stable in the air. But the Wright brothers said, no, it's got to be more like a bicycle, and you got to provide continuous control. So let's go back one slide here, okay? And what the Wright brothers said is just like a bicycle rider shifts their weight from side to side as they're pedaling, so a pilot in a plane, even then and now, continuously adjusts the control of the airplane to keep it stable. Okay, so in other words, there's always a certain amount of adjustment that's taking place. Of course, today, when we say an airplane is flown by wire or flown by a computer is making those observations, those measurements, those calculations, and adding, opening or closing the controls on an airplane. Now, the Wright brothers actually got, and now we got to skip down. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. The Wright brothers came up with a way to get that control of the wing, and basically continually adjust their flight by doing something very unusual. One of the Wright brothers one day was working in a bicycle shop, and they were puzzling over how they were going to build their airplane. And he started playing with a cardboard box where they had ripped off it was a long, narrow cardboard box, kind of like you get spaghetti in, but on either end of it, they'd ripped it off, and the box had been originally where an inner tube for a bicycle had come from. And he was just twisting the box in his hands, and he suddenly realized, this is how we're going to build an airplane. Okay, so you're going to have two wings, one on the top, one on the bottom. It's going to be a biplane. The pilot is going to sit in the middle, kind of at the middle where that red arrow is going, and the way the pilot is going to operate it is he's going to warp the wings. He's going to pull down the wing on one side or pull the wing up on another side, so he can basically bank the plane and have it turn to the right or turn to the left. If he lifts the front end or the back end of the front side, the leading edge of the wing, or the back edge of the wing, he can make the plane go up. He can make the plane go down. And indeed, just keep in mind that the back of the plane would be where the red arrow is, and the big black arrow is pointing. So the whole plane is going to fly, if you will, into the screen. It's a very unusual way to control wings. We don't control wings anymore this way. Instead, on the back edge of wings, as you probably know from flying, and if you sit in a window seat near the wings, you can see that there's hinge sections on the trailing edge of the wing that that basically is the control surfaces that allow the plane to turn right or left or go up or down. And that's how we do it now. But the Wright brothers wanted to test out this wing warping idea, and so they were very kind of, they were highly focused individuals. Neither of them ever got married. They were highly dependent on their sister, Catherine, who indeed, in some ways, we should say that the invention of the airplane is not the result of two people, but three people, the Wilbur, Orville, and the third person being her sister, Catherine. There is a separate biography, I'm happy to say, that came out, I don't know, 5 or 7 years ago of Catherine. But the Wright brothers basically sort of said, all right, we got this idea. There's not enough wind in Dayton, Ohio. So where should we go? So they typed up a letter. They sent it to the U.S. Weather Service, and they asked the U.S. Weather Service, your government in action. They said, where are the windiest places in the continental United States? And the Weather Service wrote back and gave them a list. And at the top of the list was Kitty Hawk on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Now, I know Andy is now a native of North Carolina, but may I say that in 1900, when the Wright brothers went there, the Outer Banks were just about the outer limits, okay? Yeah. They were a completely impossible place to get to. So is it Elizabeth City that's on Albemarle Sound, Andy? On the eastern?
Yeah, just near there, and you're absolutely right.
Right. So the Wright brothers would take a train all the way to Elizabeth City, and that was the end of the line. That is as close as they could get by railroad to the Outer Banks. They then would have to take a steamship or a sailboat from Elizabeth City, which is a port, out to the Outer Banks with all their stuff. And there they would camp out in the late fall, early winter, because that's when the winds were the best, and they would conduct their experiments. And they went there, basically late fall of 1899, 1900, 1901, and ultimately in 1903. Now, at Kitty Hawk, they did 1,000. They basically first they flew a box kite that looks like this image that we're looking at right now, and then they built a glider like this, and they flew from the sand dunes over 1,000 glider flights, and they kept adjusting the design on the basis of those flights. What those flights taught them is there was something wrong with those lift tables begun by Cayley and then perfected by Octave Chanute, that they weren't getting, that the Wrights weren't getting the amount of lift, the amount of energy, the amount of force that the tables predicted. So the Wright brothers, being anally compulsive guys, went back to Dayton and they built themselves the first wind tunnel. And that's on the next slide. Okay, and it basically was driven by the steam engine that ran everything else in their little bicycle shop, and it was basically a great big wooden box. And in the back, on one end you had a big fan on the right end, and that's where you see the red arrow for the flow direction. On the back end, on top was a little window, and they could look in the window and they could watch how different little sections of wings, which are shown on the right-hand side, operated in the airflow. And on the basis of that, they worked out an entirely new set of tables and gave them the information they need in order to design a wing with an optimal lift. Now, with that information, they got on the train, went back to Elizabeth City, sailed across Albemarle Sound, went to the beach, and in the fall of 1903, they combined everything that they had decided about the engine, about the wing warping, and wing shape, and they created their first flyer. And indeed, as one of you already pointed out in the chat line, it wasn't a week, but it was 10 days later, on 17th of December 1903, 10 days after Langley's failure on the Potomac, that the Wrights successfully flew at Kitty Hawk. And one of the most interesting things that, again, when we work with teachers in the workshop on flight at the Kennedy Space Center is this we show them where to find materials about the Wright brothers on the Library of Congress website, and there's a selection of newspaper stories, and it's really interesting to see how newspapers, not on 18th of December 1903, but in the weeks and months immediately following the Wright brothers' flight, how people greeted it and how they made sense of it. The Wright brothers, as you may know, and we need the next slide here, flew on that first flight only 852 feet, and they flew the best flight they had that day was only 59 seconds. But it was enough to convince the Wright brothers that they were indeed on the right track, and they continued to work on their plane for a number of years to follow. One of the reasons why I like this particular blurry image from I believe it's from the Library of Congress collections is you can see one of the Wright brothers, and I can never remember, I apologize, which one it is in the plane. They actually did a coin toss to decide who got to fly the plane first. And you can see down dead sort of center bottom the shadow of the other brother who's taking the picture. I just love that. So Justin is providing you some information as to where to find some of the great materials at the Library of Congress that they put together for teachers. So check out his URLs. Okay, now having built a functional airplane, the Wright brothers proceeded to patent it. And they did what all inventors want to do, is they wanted to sell their patent, their invention, to somebody and live happily ever after. Now, in other areas, other time periods, the first customers for airplanes, might have been civilian businessmen. But in the 1900s, the most promising customers for airplanes proved to be the military in both the U.S. and in Europe. And the reason for this has nothing to do with airplanes, but it has everything to do with an arms race, and actually a naval arms race. And let's jump to the next slide here. There is the mighty Dreadnought. Okay, the Dreadnought was a ship first built by the British Navy. If you look closely at the image, you can see it's got a little British flag up there. And the British announced in the late 1880s, early 1890s, that they were going to have a navy that was superior to everybody else, and it was going to be built around battleships with steel. Steel was extra strong, heavy armor, and it was going to have incredibly big guns, cannons, on it, and that these were going to be the super weapons, or if we were talking about Star Wars, the Death Star of the early 20th century. And basically, other countries, including the U.S., Germany, Russia, France, all then began to decide that they needed to build their own big fleets of ships to protect themselves from these big ships being built by the British. So the British basically launched an arms race that ultimately ends up bringing about World War I. Now, we've often in American history classes talk about this sort of naval arms race because we talk about the Spanish-American War, and we talk about the Great White Fleet that the U.S. Navy had at that point. And the Great White Fleet indeed were America's answers to the Dreadnought. And we know about Roosevelt and Roosevelt's desire as president to basically increase the size of the U.S. Navy, and indeed to make sure the U.S. had one of the had a navy that basically could function in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. But navies and governments and the military also thought about what are the other inventions that you need in order to deal with this new sort of super weapon, the Dreadnought, as particularly something that might attack you. And my man Nikola Tesla basically came up with a remote controlled wireless torpedo that he thought would be the way that you would basically, larger small countries could basically have these torpedoes, and they could basically send them out and explode them underneath and blow up if these ships came to attack, say, a port like New York or Boston. But the other thing that people were interested in was reconnaissance. Could we have something where we could go out and detect whether these battleships were coming after us? And that is why the U.S. Army and other countries were interested in buying airplanes from the Wright brothers. And the Wright brothers, indeed, their first sale of an airplane came in 1909 when they sold it to the Signal Corps of the U.S. Army. And the next few years, European powers also acquired airplanes and began to experiment how to use them in war. So reconnaissance was really the interesting thing that people were interested in with early airplanes, and that indeed shaped the major way that airplanes were used in World War I. And the next slide shows us probably my all-time favorite World War I plane. Those of us of a certain age know that Snoopy in Peanuts was always fighting the Red Baron. And Andy, what kind of plane did Snoopy always take off on when he was on his doghouse, pretending to be a World War I fighter pilot?
It always seemed to be the winning plane. What kind was it, Bernie? Oh.
That it was. You'll probably remember this. It was a Sopwith Camel, and that's what you see here. The Sopwith Camel was a British plane, and indeed this is the Sopwith Camel. So this is Snoopy's plane. So during the war, people basically, both sides, used the airplane to collect information. So they wanted to figure out where the Germans or the British during trench warfare in 1914, 1915, 1916, they wanted to figure out where were the big artillery pieces. They also wanted to identify where, if there were any troop movements, because if there were troop movements on either side of the trench warfare and you had that information before the other side, you could marshal your troops, you could marshal your artillery, and you might break through and win the war. And they did drop a few bombs but most of it was reconnaissance. Now, because the information that, say, a British pilot might acquire flying over German lines was so important, the Germans, developed, the desire to basically shoot down these planes or launch planes to basically fight and chase off the British planes before they got any information. And so dogfights are a result of this competition or this fighting between reconnaissance planes and trying to prevent, the British Sopwith Camel getting back with the key information, or the Red Baron getting back in his triplane. In other words, his plane had 3 wings from getting back as well. And that's where dogfighting began. And it was the first real application of military application of World War I. And it was dangerous, and it was difficult. If you want to think about sort of real daring do individuals, these initial planes basically had machine guns that were mounted right in front of the pilot, right on top of the engine, and they hadn't figured out how to basically have the bullets initially go when the propeller was out of the way. So they designed the propeller initially to have metal plates on it, but that meant that if a bullet hit the metal plate on the wing, it then could ricochet back and kill the pilot. So it was fairly, in more ways than one, pretty dangerous to basically be, a fighter pilot in World War I.
Bernie, let me interrupt you briefly and just ask a question. I'm really struck, and I've been waiting for the right time to bring this up. I think I'm really struck by the ways in which we're essentially talking about a lot of science and a lot of sort of engineering kinds of concepts, but in the context of humanities, and of course that's what you do every day as an historian in the engineering school. But I'm curious about how quickly this innovation called aviation responded to human needs and interests. So, the Wright brothers had a particular sort of outcome in mind, I'm assuming, as they developed the first plane. And then quickly it started to, humans started to apply that to human condition, to human needs, to human interests. And you've now taken it very quickly within just a few decades to conflict, to battle, to reconnaissance.
Right.
How do you see, just even outside of aviation, how do you see science responding to the human condition in that way? It seems like that's all science is finding solutions to human problems.
Yeah, well, and certainly above all, engineering is trying to find solutions to human problems even more than than science. And I think in plenty of earlier eras, before the 20th century, engineering and technology and the sort of, if you will, the mechanic arts really were much more focused on paying attention to the everyday the needs of everyday people, and also to to kind of shaping the civilian economy. I mean, the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th, early 19th century, for the most part, was about growing the civilian sector. And what's interesting is that I would argue for pretty much exclusively geopolitical reasons, science and engineering in the late 19th century, and I'll use the word, got hijacked by governments in order to to fight major wars. And World War One is in some ways truly the first major technological war that is really driven by the availability of airplanes, which is what we're talking about here, but also automobiles, tanks, trucks, that sort of thing, and also the railroad, and being able to mobilize and move thousands of troops very quickly to the front lines in order to take over major territory. So my answer to your question is again, my major theme is to argue that something unusual happens in the very last the very last moments of the 19th century, but the early 20th century, which shifts a lot of development of new technology to warfare. That I would not make the argument that that's always the case, but there's something unusual about the geopolitical situation of the 20th century that results in this, and again, my word, not necessarily others, hijacking of technology, but particularly of aviation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do want to follow up just briefly with a question from Mike, who asks, did they use planes in World War One to shoot into trenches that troops were unable to get to?
That's a good question. I'd have to go back and look at it. My sense is that they didn't. These planes were not used for strafing the troops. But I'm embarrassed to say that I don't have a definitive answer one way or the other about that. And I'm not even sure where to point Mike to a good place to figure that out. So I wish I had a definitive answer, but I don't.
I'll chime in and say that, to my knowledge, having done a fair amount of work in the trench system there in World War One and at Musargan, that's not the case. Maybe because of because of the location of airstrips, maybe it's maybe it's the way that airships were integrated into the military effort, and that's just not one of them. But I don't think that happened very often.
Yeah. I think you're right. It's the design of the airplanes don't lend itself to that particular tactic. So there's that. But back to your point about sort of, okay, so when does this technology get shaped to human ends? That begins to happen in the 1920s, right after World War One, and governments both in Europe and America are interested in supporting aviation in a variety of ways. And it is a fascinating story of the fact that aviation as a technology is again strongly shaped by the involvement of the state. Our students would find that surprising, because we tend to kind of have a Silicon Valley view, which is all new, high tech comes from Silicon Valley, comes from civilian startups, and to some extent, doesn't appear to have any real involvement with the government. And indeed, some of the most conservative, sort of people that when you want to talk about innovation and government regulation are when I talk to people from the Silicon Valley. But the reality is the government often plays a strong role in shaping the development of new technology, particularly new transportation technology. And our students would be, should be familiar with the role that the state of New York played in investing in and basically financing, pardon me, the creation of the Erie Canal in the 1820s, or the transcontinental railroads were built because the federal government gave excuse me, railroads, hundreds of thousands of acres of land that they could turn around and sell. In other words, they were given land grants. Or almost in our own time in the 1950s, the decision that that the federal government made to create the interstate highway system, during the Cold War, and the official name of the interstate highway system, as some people know, is the National Defense Highway System, for the U.S. So we shouldn't really be surprised by this, but it's interesting to talk a little bit about the ways in which the government, sponsored, the U.S. government sponsored aviation. Now, European governments like the Dutch straight up created national state-owned airlines, and the first airline indeed is KLM that the Dutch created in 1919. In the U.S., we didn't create state airlines, but we instead gave fledgling airline companies, lucrative contracts to carry the mail. And indeed, that's part of the way that the railroads grew up, is they carried the mail and made money by basically carrying the mail from one city to another. So the U.S. Post Office sponsored airmail service, and indeed, if you have stamp collectors, in your midst, they'll tell you exactly when, the first in the 1920s, the first airmail stamps turned up, because it was more expensive, not surprisingly, to send a letter overnight, or very quickly using airmail. So that was one way that aviation took off. Another way that the government supported aviation in the in the 1920s. And yes, I see Ricardo says that indeed Silicon Valley benefited from the government R&D, and yes, it's sort of an untold story that the government paid for a lot of the development of integrated chips and the modern solid state transistors and technology that we use. But another thing that the government did is not only sponsored the airmail service, but they invested in aviation research, and a lot of this research was a significant portion of it was supported by the forerunner of NASA. And this is the next slide, which was called the National Council or National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or the way it's pronounced is NACA. And NACA basically encouraged a number of universities, Stanford being one of them, Caltech being another, Iowa State being a third, to undertake research to understand, the real principles behind lift. And probably the father of all of this is a great engineering scientist, Theodore von Karman. One example of the problems that people encountered is how do you design a plane that that basically does not get bounced around when the air is turbulent. And turbulence is the result of the fact that you have a phenomena which is called vortex shedding. And I love this image because it really captures it well. So on the left, you basically got wind coming from the left to the right. The circle is your slice of an airfoil, and you can see that some of the air goes up over the top, some of the air goes up under the bottom. But when the air from the top and the air from the bottom meet up again, they create a tail, which is actually like a little tornado. It's a vortex that is this thing in the back, and that is what causes planes to bounce around when they hit turbulence in the sky. Okay, so if you can eliminate that tail, that vortex, if you can shed it, you can make flight be a lot more comfortable and a lot smoother for people. And research supported by NACA solved this problem by doing an interesting but simple solution we see in the next slide. Is if you have an airplane like this, and instead of having a hard right angle between the body of the airplane, that's called the fuselage, and the wing, you look closely, what they've done is they filled in that space with a nice gentle curve, and that's called the fillet. Okay, and that streamlines the joint, and it allows the air to move smoothly over the top and the bottom of the wing and blend back together, and the plane doesn't bounce around as much. So, the next time you're on a plane, you want to look at these sort of little design features, because these are the things that make a plane comfortable and desirable, for ordinary humans to fly. So, during the 1920s and the 1930s, the government invested significantly in civilian aviation as a result of the airmail contracts. We saw the beginning of the first airlines like American Airlines, Eastern Airlines, United Airlines. One that dates me is TWA. All of those airlines got their start carrying the mail in the 1920s. Aviation was also supported by the federal government through NACA and solving problems like vortex shedding. But all of the major powers, the Americans, Germans, and the British, realized that in the 1930s that the next war was going to definitely involve airplanes in a significant way. And they pushed their engineers, each country did, to develop planes that were going to, be able to carry big payloads of bombs, and they wanted to be able to carry those big payloads over longer distances and have the planes fly even faster. Now, the context here is significant. And I know that, Andy, you sort of said, gee, why is it that the technology got hooked up, with military needs, with killing people, as opposed to, civilian needs? And again, the context is important. Military planners in the 1930s came to the conclusion that the next war that probably was going to be fought was going to be a total war. Wars before the 20th century were in many ways limited wars, and they were limited in the sense that there were rules of war, and that basically, Army A would fight Army B, and basically, that the civilians were not to be attacked. That's what the rules of war meant. Okay, and we still have rules of war where civilians, are not really supposed to be caught in the fray, but if you have two industrial countries fighting each other, they're going to be able to keep putting more soldiers, more guns, more artillery, more airplanes, more tanks out there as long as they have their industrial capacity. So if one industrial country wants to defeat another industrial country, they're going to have to basically destroy the industrial capacity of the opposing country. That meant that you were going to bomb cities and you were going to bomb industries, and you were going to move towards total war. So total war, if that was sort of the military policy, meant that you were going to completely change airplanes and fight wars in a very different way. And you were going to develop bigger airplanes. And I want to talk a little bit about how fast airplanes grew during World War II. Okay, so this slide summarizes, this notion of total war, and military bombers became the weapon of choice for fighting the war. And indeed, probably the most important first round of total war was the Battle of Britain, in which in 1940 Hitler sent wave after wave of big heavy bombers. This is an American bomber, obviously, but similar bombers were sent to basically attack Britain day and night, with the hopes that he would destroy the industrial capacity of Britain, and he would break the will of the British people, and that they would then, when there was in 1941 an amphibious invasion of Britain by German soldiers, that the Germans would basically the British would basically surrender. Okay. And it's an important point for our students, is it's an example of total war. In response, all countries, but particularly the U.S., really scaled up the size of airplanes. And let's go to the next slide. And just to, we could geek out on technical details of airplanes, but just think about these two planes. The B-17, which is basically the sort of state-of-the-art plane circa 1939, 1940, has those characteristics. Can fly 2,000 miles, wingspan of 103 feet. just after the war, introduced 1945, 1946, is from the Boeing company. That's what the B means, is the B-36, which has a wingspan that is twice as big, but its payload, the number of bombs it can carry, goes from 65,000 to 320,000. Okay, so it's the payload is increased by 5 times, and the cruising range is increased by 4 times, from 2,000 to 8,000 miles. To make that jump in a little less than 5 years, involves an incredible amount of engineering capability. And it really underlines again, that the military and government investment in this technology and driving it to be bigger and better is central to the story. The B-36 is an interesting airplane. 2 things, you probably have noticed that unlike the B-17, the propellers are on the back end of the back side of the wing. It's one of the few big military airplanes that was ever built like this. The engines are piston engines, and they are the largest piston engines that I think were probably ever built for any application. And overall, the B-36 is the largest American military plane bomber that ever got built. And B-52s, which were still flying and were introduced in the early 1950s, are actually smaller than the B-36. So bigger is not always, necessarily better. Now, I tell you about these bombers because it sets up the story of civilian jet airliners and aviation aircraft. Okay, in the 1950s, aircraft firms, and I think we can go to the next slide here, my friend Andy. Big airplane manufacturers like Boeing had created factories like you see here, and they. The military would buy so many airplanes, and then the military might not buy any airplanes the following year. So if you're going to be, you're going to run a big corporation and you're going to have big factories like this, you want to operate them at capacity, as big, have as many different planes coming off the line as you can. And so they decided, Boeing, Lockheed, and others, that what they needed to do is they needed to take the airplanes that they had developed for military purposes and use them to create civilian aircraft. And the next slide shows us one of the great examples. Right after the war, the Boeing basically created for the U.S. Air Force a military transport, the C-97. And as soon as they got that built, they got permission to basically convert that into an airliner. And on the right, you see the civilian version, the Stratocruiser, and a great image of the flights in every day, from Milwaukee on Northwest Airlines. But again, you wouldn't have had those civilian airplanes on the right if you weren't building, the military planes and having the military fund all of the engineering design work for the military for the military plane.
Hey, Bernie, we've got a quick question from Juliet, who asks, does the letter B mean bomber, as in B-2, like the F means fighter, as in the F-18?
No, my understanding is the B means that it's, in this case, it's produced by Boeing.
And Jennifer and Ricardo both chimed in with that answer.
Great. Okay. So then, in the world of groupthink, we're on the right track. Okay. So, and I know the hour draws late, so I'm going to focus a little bit more here, and then bring us to a conclusion about this. And the last thing that I really want to talk about is the Boeing 707, and then I want to talk a little bit about jet engines, and then we'll call it a night and take a few more questions. So just like they took that transport plane and they converted that into a Stratoliner, so Boeing also took what was the tanker that was used to refuel planes that were flying long distance flights, basically when the first B-47s and then B-52s were carrying nuclear bombs, just to the edge, to the border of the Soviet Union. And if you've ever seen or have your students watch Dr. Strangelove to, sort of see what that was like, those planes had to be refueled in midair. And again, amazing accomplishment is the U.S. Air Force figured out how you can do what you see on the left, have a big tanker refuel planes while they're flying in midair. But the Boeing took the tanker plane, the KC-135, retooled that, and that became the Boeing 707. And the basic jet airliner that, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, is the reliable, was the workhorse of civilian aviation and airlines, through the late 50s all the way into the 1970s. And again, it's the beginning of the series. What we're up to now is the 787, the Dreamliner. So there's a 707. I don't think there's a 717. There's a 727, 737, 747. Most of you have ridden on various versions that are the next generation of the Boeing aviation series. And Boeing, I should say, is not the only American airplane manufacturer that did this. Douglas had a long series of planes that they developed in the same way as did Lockheed. But Boeing probably until Airbus came along in the 80s, was the dominant player in the jet airliner market. So it's a jet airliner. So let me talk a little bit for a moment about jet engines and where they came from. In the 1920s, again with support from from governments and the military, several different inventors started thinking about going from piston engines to something else. And in another field of engineering, electrical engineering, the first electric power plants that were such as the one that Edison introduced in downtown New York in the early 1880s, through the 1880s up until the early 1900s, all of those plants were run by steam engines, and those steam engines had big pistons. But piston engines are not necessarily the most efficient way to do it, and engineers began to design in the early 1900s a new type of steam engine, which was called a turbine. And in fact, almost all electricity today, whether it comes from a nuclear powered plant or a coal-fired plant, basically has an electric generator that is connected to a turbine, to an engine that basically has fan blades on it. Okay. So, guys like Whittle in England or von Ohain in Germany began to sort of say, supposing we get rid of the piston engines, but we come up with a turbine to do this. Now, for a jet engine to work on an airplane, you basically have to combine compression and combustion in order to create a really fast airflow. And as the air shoots out of the back of the airplane, it creates thrust and the plane goes forward. And the next slide, I want to just talk for a little bit about this, and then we'll take a few questions. Is a turbojet essentially consists of a series of parts. You basically, from the left to the right, the air gets sucked in. The air gets sucked in because there's a compressor. The air is then is compressed and then pushed into a combustion chamber where you squirt in basically kerosene or diesel fuel. The diesel fuel ignites, is very hot, and the hot gas is not only hotter, but it's under higher pressure. It's also has greater velocity, and it rushes out the back end, gives you the thrust. But as it's going out the back end, you let the escaping hot fluid basically turn one more set of blades, and those blades are all connected on a single shaft from the right to the left, and that means that they then have the power that is basically pushing the front end of the plane, sucking the air in. And it works because you basically are able to compress and then heat up that air, and as that hot air goes out, it creates the thrust or the energy that you need. So, and then thank you for Juliet for finding additional information about these codes for how the Air Force, indicates or picks the way that we talk about airplanes. So there's a couple more slides that I'm going to jump over here because I want to give time for questions. The first jet plane was built by the Germans. The Germans didn't do much with jet planes because Hitler believed that the jet engine ought to be put on bombers, and it's not really well designed for bombers. And so, German jet planes saw limited action in World War II. There's a number of advantages, and you can read those on your own on the next slide, which, if you'll just jump to that, Andy, there's some advantages that became clear during the Cold War. Jet aircraft have fewer moving parts. They can fly faster. They can fly, more efficiently at higher altitudes. And so all of those things are why we, gradually shifted in a lot of aviation applications away from piston engines to jet engines. There are still some applications. When I lived for a few years in northern Michigan, and you had to fly during snowstorms, the pilots, would tell me that they were still flying piston or turboprops then because the turboprop had better control in a snowstorm. And I said, if that's what the case is, then let's keep flying turboprops. So now we're going to skip a slide about fan jets, I believe. Okay, so let's go to the end here. So what I'm trying to say tonight is that the Wright brothers played a pivotal role. It took unique people to sort of see the opportunity to develop aircraft that were more like a bicycle and less like an airship or a balloon or a traditional ship. And the Wright brothers had that fundamental insight. And so the Wright brothers are the pivotal people in the story of aviation. But even more important than that is this aviation looks the way that it does because of the context of the 20th century. The geopolitics that were involved in the run up to World War I, the sort of notions that people had about total war, that led to World War II, the desire to basically be able to place bombs, or drop atomic bombs on the Soviet Union in the Cold War. All of those political and military strategies informed the growth and the development of aviation. And while we don't often think about the military and governmental origins of aviation, that's why we're able to have air travel that, we can practically take for granted today. That, we need to be, we need to be to see loved ones for an emergency on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in a few hours. We can do that. And I think we spend, a significant amount of time, complaining about air traffic delays, the cost of airline tickets, worrying about, accidents, and accidents sadly do happen, like the Southwest Airlines, accident, in the last 10 days. But we ought to stop and marvel at the remarkable principles such as lift, or the intricate engines such as jet engines that make modern aviation possible. And perhaps in some ways, we need to be a little less like the medieval plowman in that painting I showed you at the beginning, preoccupied with our own affairs and needs. And occasionally, maybe we need to, as we buckle up in an airplane, we need to look out over the wing, or we need to look at that airplane overhead when we're out and about, and marvel at the human creativity and the social context that made flight possible. So that's the point I wanted to make at the end here is the importance of the social context of aviation. And I bet some folks have got some questions about that. And as they say, the chat box is open. So, Andy, we got anything in there I ought to jump on and address right away?
So, thank you, Bernie. You shared a lot of great information. You may have noted, by the way, that Juliet, she's providing all this supporting information, and she let us know that her uncle was a Tuskegee Airman. So it's a nice.
Oh, great.
So, what other questions do we have from the audience? I've got a couple up my sleeve as well, but I'm continue to be struck, Bernie, by by the ways in which you're telling the story, essentially telling the human story, but doing it through engineering and through science. See what other kinds of questions come out.
Yeah. And while they're doing that, just let me put in a sort of plug, for kind of my approach. I really see that, we spend a lot of time celebrating, and rightly so, all sorts of human accomplishments. So we invite our students to read great works in literature, great novels, great poems. We ask them or encourage them to look at at wonderful paintings or sculpture. And I'd argue that we ought to encourage people to remember that technology and engineering are equally examples of human. They're equal to in terms of being masterpieces of creativity and genius.
That's a great way to say it. I do have one question for you, and I'm going to riff a little bit with Carol Pixton, who her question is about the recent accident that Southwest the Southwest tragedy. But I'm going to reframe that a little bit. I'm going to ask you, one of the other ways to tell this story of air technology, aviation technology, and 20th century America is through regulatory history. So tell us a little bit about kind of the ways in which the government regulated air travel, aircrafts. It's very common to have a fear of flying, as Catherine just says. But what kind of role did the government have in terms of regulating air?
Well, right from the get-go, it was the federal government that basically first designated routes for the planes that were carrying the mail had to follow a very particular route, and they got across the country, because I've forgotten now, it's about every 100 miles or so, they set up big beacons, light beacons that allowed basically the pilots to fly from point to point. And of course, those then were replaced by radio beacons, and indeed, the radio beacons are still there, but airplanes, of course, use radar, to stay on that particular pathway, those airways. And as more and more planes, flew those particular routes, then you basically had the federal FAA, take responsibility for the air traffic controllers. And it's a federal government employee that basically makes sure that they're doing that. We depend on on the government to basically specify what constitutes a safe airplane, and all the safety features that a plane has, and the rules by which the plane has to be checked out before every flight are all based on federal regulations. And it is, it's a remarkable amount of things. And indeed, you sometimes, the pilot will get on and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, we got everybody on board. We've got all of the baggage on, and we're just finishing up the paperwork." Well, the paperwork is the way that they show that flight is in compliance with a whole host of safety regulations that the government has put in place. And as we've seen with the Southwest Airlines thing, the major, a major issue is planes. Planes can. What's interesting, I have a professor here who's now retired, who's an expert on basically aluminum alloys in airplanes. And as he said, it isn't about how many hours you fly; it's how many times the plane takes off and lands. And if you think about it, that's where you really stress the parts of the airplane and the parts of the engine. And so after so many takeoff and landings, they have to basically take that jet airliner and they have to take it offline, basically have it stop flying, and they have to take the whole jet engine apart and look at every single one of those fan blades. Now, this is where Southwest Airlines has gotten itself into a bit of a problem, and it's got to figure out where it is with the federal government, which is it was cutting it too close and not doing enough of those required inspections. And so that's an example. Southwest accident it's about materials. It's about a fan blade just basically gave out, but somebody should have checked all the fan blades in that engine probably anywhere from a few weeks to a few months ago. So
Bernie?
Mike has asked, should I go to that deregulation question, or
Sure.
where do we want to go?
Let's
Andy?
make that our last question of the night.
Okay. Yeah, you're right, because people had a long day, teaching and what have you, whether they're on the East Coast or the West Coast. We've all had a busy day. So one of the ways that policy and economics comes to play in the aviation industry is around deregulation. And in the 1980s, basically during the Reagan years, the conservative economists basically sort of said, we will get more competition, we will get cheaper airplane. More competition means that we'll get cheaper airfares, and we'll get greater choice in services if we deregulate the industry. Okay. And so as a result, the industry got deregulated in the 1980s, but for a number of reasons that we can't go into here, but are covered in the sort of secondary reading I suggested by David Mowry. Deregulation actually has resulted in the fact that we have fewer airlines and fewer incentives for the airlines to basically cut the price of airline tickets and go competitive toe to toe. So it's again an interesting example of where political ideology and economic reality meet up.
Right, Bernie. I can't thank you enough for leading the session tonight. As Mike West says in the chat box, it's really amazing to think of how aviation engineering over thousands and thousands of worldwide flights, really how reliable it is. Bernie, I know we're going to see you again next fall early on. I want to thank you again for joining us tonight.
Yeah, and let me just say tonight we thank you to the 73 people that joined us. I hope that I gave you an interesting balance of some rich stories, some rich technical details, but in a way that is accessible. But again, I invite you to talk to your students about those two things. How airplanes really are an example of an artistic and engineering masterpiece, and that they need to be able to look at technologies and sort of say, so what did the government or what did businesses, what did policy have to do with why the technology looks the way that it does? Because that's where we will get an informed citizenry that we need so much today in the coming years. So thank you, Andy, and thank you, Justin, for inviting me to do this. Everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you again next fall.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of our attendees tonight for joining us for tonight's webinar session. I'd encourage you to keep track of the National Humanities Center and the professional development opportunities we have, not just long distance learning like tonight's webinar, but also our face-to-face events. You can follow us at Facebook and at Instagram and Twitter and get all the updates for new initiatives and projects and programs. As I said earlier, you will receive a prompt to complete a survey, and that survey will then generate the certificate for attending tonight's session. Please take a moment to do that. Usually it takes just a few moments after I close the room, and then usually the evaluation is emailed to you by within the hour or so. I've also recorded tonight's session, and we will make it available through both the NCHE website and the National Humanities Center YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that in the next 48 hours or so. And again, I want to thank you for joining us. Tomorrow night is our last webinar of the 2017-18 season. We'll be working with Alex Wolick from Stanford University on George Orwell's 1984 and the Art of Political Writing. At this time, this webinar is sold out. We've reached capacity at 200, but we always have somebody, one or two people who have a conflict come up and they drop their spot. So if you're interested in this one and you're not signed up, please shoot me an email and I'll put you on our waiting list and we'll sign you up if a slot does appear. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day at school tomorrow. If we don't see you again this year, have a great end of year, and we'll see you again next fall with the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night.